Welcome, everyone. This is Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Yevamot. This class is part of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein's Mishnah Division and is sponsored in the memory of Rifka Rosenwein by her family. This course is an accompaniment to daily independent study of Mishnah following the Mishnah Yomit cycle. Thank you for everyone who's been joining us for all of Yevamot as we finish this up over the next 2 weeks. We have the pleasure of learning this week, as we have for the past previous weeks, with Rabbi David Silber, the Dean of Drisha. One moment of housekeeping as I see people coming in. I will send you invitations to panelists. You do not have to teach. I strongly recommend you accept this invitation. It means you can turn on your camera, ask questions directly, participate in class, show your face. If you are not in a place where you can do that, that's fine. Questions are always welcome over Zoom and in Facebook in chat. I will monitor the chat for questions and bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. All I ask is, if you are a panelist, to please keep yourself muted unless you are actively speaking. We can and will hear all background noise. Sources for today come from the 12th chapter of Yevamot. If you have your own copy of Mishnah Yomit, you are welcome to use it. I will also be sharing the sources on screen from Sfaria. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are learning Yevamot, and this weekly class is to make some general points about the mishnayot, to pick out some of the more critical mishnayot, perhaps in terms of understanding the larger issues of Masechet Yevamot. As I pointed out in the very beginning, one of the challenges of learning Mishnah is to try to figure out, if possible, what in the world is the order of the mishnayot. Within each tractate, is strange. They often appear to be very strange. So I'm not going to solve that problem. I'm not even going to try, but I'll point out simply that Masechet Yevamot, as it suggests, is about Yibum, levirate marriage. So we know that man dies, couple dies, the man has no children, and then if there's the brother, says the Torah, marries the widow of the deceased brother, and somehow the kin lines of the deceased brother are extended. The Torah said actually, and the Gemara Mishnah interprets it differently, but the Torah said in chapter 25, literally, it means that the first child who's born shall be related to the deceased brother. His name shall be established. The deceased brother's name shall be continued through this firstborn child. That's what the Torah seems to say. The Gemara and Mishnah have a different understanding. So Mishnah we saw that that doesn't mean that the firstborn that's born, but it means the Bechor, the oldest brother, has the responsibility to marry the wife of the deceased brother. That's called Yibum. And that's what the Mishnah is about. Not all the tractate, but a lot of the mishnayot. It's called Masechet Yevamot. And we have examples of Yibum in the Torah. Apart from the parsha of Yibum, which is in chapter 25 of Devarim, we have a couple of stories of Yibum. The most obvious is the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is all about Yibum. Boaz is Miyabeim Ruth. Now, I'll come back to that later. That's, if everything works the way it's supposed to work, apparently, that's what's supposed to happen. However, the Torah itself said, what about a situation, in the case of the Chumash, where the man says, I don't want to marry you. I don't want to marry you. For whatever reason. He doesn't give a reason necessarily. Doesn't want to marry you. Doesn't like her, whatever. The Torah then says that there's an alternative, which is called chalitza. You would expect that before the Mishnah drifted off into all kinds of other rules about other situations of marriage, eating of truma, who one can marry and can't marry, one would have expected that the discussion of chalitza would take place towards the very beginning of this tractate. It is mentioned in the beginning of the tractate, mentioned several times in situations, can you do yibum, can you do chalitza? But the Mishnah never says what chalitza is, until, lo and behold, we come to chapter 12. In chapter 12, it's a short chapter that we'll look at this afternoon, which deals with the mitzvah of chalitza. So there's 6 mishnayot in chapter 12, and It begins in chapter 12, the very first Mishnah, Mitzvah Chalitza B'Shlosha Dayanim. Afilu Shloshtan Hedyotot. That's the first Mishnah in chapter 12. So the first interesting point about this Mishnah is the first two words, which is mitzvah chalitza. The mitzvah of chalitza. In fact, this expression, mitzvah chalitza, is also found in the beginning of the sixth Mishnah of chapter 12, which is the Mishnah that we'll get to pretty soon, which describes the actual procedure of chalitza, what actually happens. Here, the question one can ask is very simply, what is the meaning of the word mitzvah? Because mitzvah can mean different things. For example, let's say in the Rambams and others, but the Rambam has a book called Sefer HaMitzvot, the book of the mitzvot, where he enumerates what, in his opinion, are the 613 commandments, the positive commandments and the negative commandments. Of course, the Rambam, before he enumerates his list of commandments, this is so Rambam-like, there's nothing like this. He actually, before he gets to what's a commandment or not, he lays down 14 principles, what defines something as a commandment. Those are called the Sharashim. Okay, we're not getting into that. It's a fascinating book. But amongst the 613 commandments, he has things like a get. Couples getting divorced, there's a mitzvah, it's one of the 613, that the man give his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, a get. Now, nobody believes that there's a mitzvah to get divorced. That would be crazy, actually. I mean, there are some situations where it's an illicit marriage, and you're supposed to get divorced. But all things being equal, there's no mitzvah of get, no mitzvah of gerushin. The mitzvah is, when they decide to get divorced, this is the way you do it. And the Rambam counts that as a mitzvah. And there are other examples as well. In other words, things that if you do it, there's a way to do it. So that's the question is...
Toar, right?
Right. Ifat Torah is even discouraged, right? Right. Ifat Torah, or Dibra Torah, Kedeged Yetzer Hara. That's even more than that. We're not suggesting that get is always bad. Sometimes it might even be very good. But the fact is, although, whatever, I'm not getting into that question. But we all know that sometimes that's the best thing to do. But the point, the Ifat Torah is actually a negative thing which the Torah permits. But so here the question is there a mitzvah of chalitza or not? Or the Mishnah just means, if you're doing it, this is the way you do it. Or does it mean there's a mitzvah? You might say, what's the difference? I'll tell you a very simple difference. Let's say the following situation. Couples married for many years, no children. They're quite old. And then the man dies. He's an old man, he dies. And there's a brother. And the woman says, the widow says, what's the point of chalitza? I don't plan to get remarried. I'm an elderly woman. I'm not getting remarried. I don't particularly care for the ceremony. And who blames her? So therefore, let's leave things the way they are. Because after all, chalitza is there to allow the woman to marry somebody else. She can't marry anybody else till she does chalitza. Assuming there's no yibum. And she can't, that's called the Yevamot Ashuk. We've seen that. There's something called Zika. We've seen all these things. So she says, I'm not interested. Shalom Yisrael, it's all wonderful and good, but this is not for me. So do we say there, no, there's a mitzvah to do it? It's a mitzvah is chalitza. Or do we say, okay, you don't want to do it? If you do want to do it, you can do it, we can then do chalitza. But if you don't really care one way or the other, forget about it. So that's the question. I believe there's a debate about that actually. Is there such a thing as mitzvah chalitza? In any event, so the language of the Mishnah is mitzvah chalitza. But again, that can be interpreted, this is the rule of chalitza. If you do it this way. Or no, there's a mitzvah to do it. Fine. Now, what is clear, I think, when you read the Chumash, and this was the very first time we met, what's obvious is that when you read the Torah, chalitza is not recommended. And the ceremony itself suggests it's not recommended because the ceremony is intended to be a degrading ceremony, as we'll see very soon. So that's obvious that the right thing to do, the Torah seems to say, is for the man to marry, the brother to marry to get married to his to the widow of his brother in order to help his brother out, to allow the brother to continue in one form or another. Doesn't want to do it? Okay. Then we have to free the woman up through chalitza. In the Gemara, though, there's already a dispute. It's not in the Mishnah, but in the Gemara, Breita, in the Gemara, there's a dispute whether is that the case, or is it you could do one or the other. There's even a view in the Gemara that it's preferable to do chalitza. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to point that out. But in the Mishnah, that's not clear at all. But we'll see in the Mishnah what the Mishnah may think. In any event, there's something called chalitza. Chalitza means to take off the shoe of the let's call the person who's supposed to do yibum, the yavam. So the woman would take off his shoe, which we'll see in the Mishnah primarily means to untie the shoe. And she does then the two other things. The Mishnah will lay it out later on, so we mention it now. Taking off the shoe seems very essential. And the Torah said that she spits more in terms in front of him, spits, and she says she also has to say certain things. He refuses to do yibum. And then at the end of it, the Torah says, and this person is called the house of the one whose shoe was taken off. Beit Chalutza now. Chapter 12 of Yevamot deals with the ceremony. What constitutes the ceremony? Because remember, what the Mishnah is doing is taking verses from the Torah and constructing a kind of law about how it's done. That's what the Mishnah does. It often does it without even citing the verses. Sometimes it does cite the verses. Usually it doesn't. But that's what the Mishnah is intended to do over here. So let's start with this Mishnah, and we'll get to the other mishnayot as well. Mitzvah Chalitza, chapter 12, Mishnah 1. Mitzvah, I'll stop periodically to take comments and questions. You can always speak up. Mitzvah Chalitza b'shlosha dayanim, va'afilu shloshton hedyotot. The first thing the Mishnah says is that the mitzvah of Chalitza, we discussed that, this ritual, is to be performed in front of three judges, even if they are hedyotot. So let's first of all, what does it mean hedyotot as opposed to dayanim? So normally speaking, a dayan is understood by the Gemara to be a person, a judge who has smicha. Now, smicha in the Talmud is somebody who has smicha can confer smicha onto somebody else. So it's a kind of it's passed down from generation to generation. It's supposed to go back to Moshe at Sinai, whatever, but it's passed down from generation to generation. That's one of the famous questions. What about when it stops? Like no one today has that smicha. Can you actually reconstitute it? Nobody has smicha. Can you start the process again? That's the famous Rambam, who seems to suggest it might be possible. There's a whole history to that. That's not a problem. But the point is, normally speaking, a dayan is a person who's expert and who has smicha. Hedyotot, a hedyot doesn't have smicha, and typically is also assumed not to be a great expert. Chalitza requires three judges, but, says the Mishnah, they don't have to have smicha. They don't have to be expert either. They can even be hedyotot. Now let's just for one moment reflect on this statement. Because, for example, let's think about the parallel to chalitza. The parallel to chalitza, if you had to pick something parallel to chalitza, we would say it's a get. Couple gets divorced. So in order for the marriage to be terminated, the Mishnah says that there's only two ways. Either the death of one of them terminates the marriage, or if the man gives his wife a get. But the get doesn't have to be the whole Tractate Yevamot, which is in this Seder Nashim, which is also a fascinating tractate. But a get is essentially the word get. What does the word get mean? Get means a contract. The Gemara talks about gite mamon. You can have a lot of different kinds of contracts. Contract to buy for sale, a gift, a sale. That's a get. Normally we use get when it comes to divorce. But a get fundamentally is a statement, written statement, that the man is making. I divorced my wife, she's free to marry anybody else. And for the get to be valid, as the Mishnah sees it, and the Gemara talks about it, it requires witnesses. I'm not getting to all the halachas of a get, but fundamentally, let's say according to one view, we have a get, a man gives his wife, soon to be ex-wife, a get, and the witnesses either witness the handing over of the get according to one view, or they simply have signatures in the get according to a different view, and the woman receives the get, and the man says, this is the bill of divorce, and she understands what she's getting. She is hereby divorced. You don't need a court for a get. You might want to go to the court, so the court has a record and all that, but fundamentally, you don't need it. Get is a document, you need witnesses, and let's say witnesses see the get being handed over, maybe witnesses in addition who sign it, but 2 witnesses is all you need. You don't need a court. When it comes to chalitza, however, it's very striking. Mitzvah chalitza b'shlosha dayanim. So chalitza seems, according to this Mishnah, seems to be different. There's a different point of view expressed in the Mishnah later on, and maybe you don't need a court. But this Mishnah says straight up, you need a court. But the court, you don't need a court of experts. A court of 3 is sufficient.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Today, don't rabbis give a get?
Yes. Nowadays we go to the Beit Din, but that's not, from strictly speaking, you don't need that. You don't need it. The rabbis do it. They go to a Beit Din to get a get. So the Beit Din has all kinds of, they tear the get up, for example, afterwards. There's all kinds of things that they do. And then if there's any issue comes up, they can certify that the woman is in fact divorced. But legally speaking, strictly speaking, you don't need a Beit Din for that. Any 2 witnesses.
And who writes the get then?
Normally the husband writes the get, or his designated shaliach writes the get.
I mean, isn't it a very specific form and stuff? That's why the rabbis do it?
Yeah, no, there are all kinds of specifics to the get, which is why you want a Beit Din to look it over, make sure it's kosher and all that. But I'm saying that's just to make sure that it's valid. But strictly speaking, you don't need it. Say you don't need a Beit Din if I'm selling you a piece of property and you want a shtar, either to prove that, either to transfer the property. See, the get has 2 functions. I don't want to get off this topic too much, but the get has 2 functions. One is to effect the divorce. That's number 1. Number 2, the get functions in the Talmud as proof that you are divorced. Now nowadays they actually tear the get up, because
right.
And the reason they tear it up is
so you can't find a mistake, no?
Exactly, because people can say, "Hey, it wasn't a kosher get," so we tear it up to prevent that from happening. But by the books, on the books, strictly speaking, you read a court for a get. Chalitza needs a Beit Din of 3. Any 3 is good.
Thank you.
Now, that's what the Mishnah says. The Gemara, though, it's interesting. The Gemara says, and the Rambam holds this way, that actually we actually on the Beit Din for Chalitza, we don't suffice with 3. We usually have 5. But the additional 2 so-called judges are not actually judges. And the reason that you have 2 additional judges or quasi-judges is because we'll see later on in the Mishnah that the Mishnah is concerned that the chalitza be in fact publicized. Now, the reason it should be publicized, it could be any number of reasons, but one of them seems to be, according to the Mishnah, that we want to embarrass the man who is not in fact doing yibum, because it's clear that the guy's supposed to do yibum under normal circumstances. So we want to publicize the fact that this fellow didn't do it. It might discourage him initially from deciding to do chalitza. Anyway, but 3 is now the requirement of 3 raises another very interesting question, which is the following: why in general do we have 3 judges? So there's a dispute in the Gemara in Sanhedrin why we have 3 judges. One says because we could learn from the verses that you need 3. The other one says no. From the Torah itself, it sounds like 2 judges are enough. But if you have 2 judges, then you're going to run into problems typically, because one judge says yes, one judge says no, one judge says Ruvain wins, one judge says Shimon. So you have a tie. So you want 3, so you could have a majority. So at least a majority rules. The strange thing is, in the case of Chalitza, presumably, Why do you need three? They're not making any decisions, just witnessing what's happening. So that's a good question, which the Tosafos deal with, but that's not our problem. In any event, point number one is you need a beit din for chalitza, right? But it can be anybody. Now the Mishnah then has the following question. I'm not dealing with all the details yet. The first thing, remember, this is like a legal code. So she has to take off, the woman unties, and it sounds like takes off the shoe of the Yavam. So the Mishnah, of course, has questions which seem to us rather trivial. First of all, the definition of a shoe. What does a shoe mean? So that's what the Mishnah talks about, especially the first Mishnah, the second Mishnah. What constitutes a shoe? Now you have to understand, at the time of the Mishnah, a shoe was made out of leather. The Torah says, when the Torah speaks about chalitza in chapter 25, it says that she takes off his shoe. The word for shoe in the Torah is na'al. Na'al, nun ayin lam, na'al. So a na'al is understood by the Gemara Mishnah to be a leather shoe, which covers the entire foot is placed inside the leather shoe. That's called a na'al. In the time of the Gemara, if you had a non-leather shoe, which in the Mishnah is the word, for example, anpilin. Anpilin is a non-leather shoe. It's made; those were presumed to be of much inferior material. Now that's not true nowadays. People buy, for example, sports shoes. Sometimes you see on Yom Kippur, they're wearing these sports shoes. So the sports shoes can cost $250, you understand? And they wear them all the time, not just on Yom Kippur. They wear them because they're extremely comfortable, very expensive, but they have no leather. So actually, the reality has changed in terms of shoes, but the Mishnah knows of leather shoes being, and the other stuff is inferior garbage. So that doesn't work. The word sandal, a sandal, which is also made out of leather, but that doesn't cover the entire foot. So the Mishnah says, sandal sheyeshua akev kosher. Okay, if it has a heel and it's made out of leather, even though it may not cover the entire foot, that constitutes a shoe. So that's, for example, the Mishnah is simply dealing with what the word now means in the Torah. That's the Mishnah. Okay, so that's one thing. Mishnah is it's a code. What kind of shoe? By the way, when you go to if you've ever seen a chalitza in a beit din, they have a special chalitza shoe. They have a special chalitza shoe. They probably have more than one because it sort of has to fit you, has to fit the man. The Mishnah says in this chapter, it doesn't have to be his own shoe. For example, Mishnah number 2. Chalza b'sando she'eno shelo, or b'sando shel eitz, or b'shel smol b'yamin, chalitzata k'shela. So the Mishnah says, if you did chalitza, the guy had a sandal on, he had a leather sandal, called a sandal, but it's not his. He borrowed it from a friend. The Mishnah says in Mishnah number 2, that is kosher. So nowadays, when you go to a beit din, they have chalitza shoes, which exactly can seem to work with it. It's not a shoe that anybody would wear today. Yes.
Right, Silber. I've
Yes.
been told, at least for the beit din of America, the shoe they have is similar in, I guess, what would be called a gladiator sandal, and so the straps can be adjusted. So that's how they make it fit.
Oh, they could an adjustable. No, I knew adjustable. I didn't realize I only have one. But yes, they have this special, the special shoe, a special chalitza shoe, which but my point is, it doesn't look like any shoe anybody would wear today. That's for sure. So it's, but we're working with the set of mishnayot in the Gemara in the 12th chapter of Yevamot. Okay. Fine. So let's just skip around here because we can't do all of this stuff. Let's skip to Mishnah number 3. Because Mishnah number 3 deals with the ceremony, and we'll get to Mishnah number 6. By the way, when you talk about chalitza, the taking off of the shoe or the untying of the shoe, so the point is that in the Tanakh we have something that sounds like chalitza, and of course that's the story in the last chapter of Megillat Ruth. In the last chapter of Megillat Ruth, Ruth speaks to Boaz, And Boaz says to Ruth, at the end of chapter 3, she's lying next to him, and he says, listen, I'm going to take care of the, Ruth says to Boaz, you are the redeemer, you are the goel. So he's a kind of Yavam. You must be related, he's related to Naomi in some way. It doesn't sound like he's a brother of Elimelech, but it sounds like he's related. We talked about that in the Tanakh. It doesn't sound like only the brother, but leave that out for now. He says, listen, I am related, he says to Ruth, and you've done a wonderful thing. You're a wonderful human being, but you got to understand, there's somebody closer than me. There's somebody who's related closer than me. But tomorrow I'll take care of it. So Ruth goes back home, and Boaz goes to the gate. He collects 10 elders, and here's the closer relative is walking by. He tells him to sit down. And he says to him, essentially, Naomi, our kindred Naomi, has lost her field, and someone's got to buy back the field for her. Somebody's take possession of her field. And the other guy says, oh, I'm happy to do that. I'm willing to do that. I'd be the goel to redeem the lost property of Naomi, or Naomi's former husband who died. Then he says, listen, the one who does that also has to marry Ruth the Moabite. It's a kind of evil. The guy says, I can't do that. I can't do that. He refuses to do that. And then the next verse in the book of Ruth says, in chapter 4 of Ruth, this was what they used to do. He would take off his shoe and give it to his friends. So the question is, what does that mean? He would take off his shoe. It does sound like chalitza. It certainly seems to be related to chalitza, but not identical to chalitza. But what is the idea of taking off your shoe? So the Rashbam are Torah in the verses in Dvarim, chapter 25, which deal with chalitza. Rashbam was a pashtan. He believed this was the plain meaning of the plain meaning of it. And the plain meaning, he says, which touches upon what we had seen last couple of weeks. The plain meaning, he says, by taking off your shoe and giving it to the other guy, you're essentially giving him, allowing him to possess property. So the idea of chalitza, in other words, the idea of the woman taking the man's shoe, the Rashbam says, this is not in the Mishnah at all. Mishnah is totally different. But the plain meaning the Rashbam claims of chalitza, just point this out, you should know this. The Rashbam says the idea is, remember we spoke last week, that yibum is not just a personal relationship, a marriage, but there's also a financial side to yibum, because the one who does yibum stands in for the deceased brother, and he also collects the deceased brother's property. He also may get a double portion of any inheritance. So there's a big financial incentive over here. And the point of chalitza, says the Rashbam, is if the woman takes the shoe off the husband, takes the shoe off the yavam, not the husband, but the brother, who refuses to do yibum, what essentially she's saying is, all the property you would have gotten, you would have inherited my former husband, your brother. But now I'm taking all that away from you. And now the ones who are going to inherit my former husband are my husband's descendants, not you. You're out of the picture. So the Rashbam says that's what chalitza is. And the idea of chalitza then is that by taking off your shoe, is by giving somebody X, that person gets not only X, but other things as well. Now, this is something very important everybody should know, that in the Gemara there's a dispute. You've probably seen this happen. For example, at weddings, if you've seen it at the chassan's tish or something, or sometimes the men and women are together, that the one who does the kedushin often takes a pen, for example, and hands it to the groom, and the groom hands it back to the officiant. And what is that about at a wedding? You've seen that, presumably. So the idea is that handing over an object, or it could be a handkerchief, that one way to affect a transaction is symbolically by giving something to somebody else And when you give the Reuven gives Shimon a pen or a handkerchief, and then Shimon is obligating himself to give Reuven or Reuven's when Reuven is acting for something else. So the point is, at a wedding, you have a ketuvah, which is the next tractate, and when the ketuvah consists of the obligation the rabbis impose upon the groom, the mutual obligations, mostly the groom towards the bride, but then the groom adds other stuff as well. It's called tosefet. He adds all kinds of stuff. 200 zuas, I'll give it 10,000 zuas. And the obligation, in order to make a real obligation, you need what's called the kinyan suder, the handkerchief kinyan. So usually, often, the bride is not in the same room. So the rabbi, the officiant, gives his own pen, often, or a handkerchief. The groom holds on to it, and when he possesses it, he obligates himself to give whatever he obligates himself to give. Then he often gives it back. That's the way it works. But in the Talmud, it's a dispute. According to one view, it's not that Reuven gives Shimon the handkerchief and Shimon obligates himself. It's that Shimon gives Reuven his own handkerchief and obligates himself in the other thing as well. So the Rashbam says, when you read the book of Ruth, that's what's going on. That's the plain reading of it. That this other guy who doesn't want to marry Ruth, and therefore is not going to get possession of the field either, he is giving his own shoe to Boaz. Here, Boaz, take my shoe. And not just my shoe. There are other obligations that come with the shoe. Says the Rashbam, that's the pshat of chalitza. Now, obviously, that is very far removed from what the Mishnah thinks chalitza is. Because chalitza for the Mishnah, we compare it to get all the time. It's the ceremony which breaks the existing relationship. Incidentally, there are incidental financial things that go along with it, but that's incidental. Fine. Anyway, I want to make that point. It's a very important Rashbam.
Excuse me?
Yes.
When you sell your chametz, they also do the thing with the pen.
Yes, they do. Right. So this is called chalipin. The term that's used for this is called chalipin. It is the universal kinyan. It works not only to transfer property, but it also works to create obligations. I said, I'm going to give you $1,000. And why? I mean, of course, I want to do it, whatever. I want to obligate myself to you. So just words alone don't create obligations, typically, with rare exceptions. So you need something to create the obligation. So this so-called chalipin, or the handkerchief kinyan, you give me a handkerchief, and when you give me the handkerchief, I then obligate myself. By the way, then you get the handkerchief back afterwards. It's not really an exchange of value, because you get it back. So it's just symbolic. That's called chalipin. Yes, chametz. It works works universally. It's the main. Anyway, that's a whole other story. That comes up in other tractates, in Bava Kama, Bava Metzia mostly, but Bava Basra. It comes up in the Bavas. Anyway, okay. So let's just take a look now about, let's say, Mishnah number 3, the ceremony. Chol Sav Rifka. So remember, she takes off his shoe, unties his shoe, takes it off, and spits and spits. And then there is the thing she has to say. She says, for example, he doesn't want to marry me. He says, I don't want to marry her. And then that's part of the ceremony. So the question the Mishnah deals with is, there's 3 things. There is taking off the shoe, untying and taking off the shoe, is spitting in front of him, and there's the stuff that they say. And now the Mishnah is discussing which of these things, you're supposed to do all of them, but which of these things is sufficient to free this woman up to marry somebody else? That's what the Mishnah deals with. So the Mishnah says, Mishnah number 3, the first case is she took the shoe off, she untied, took the shoe off, she spat in front of him, but she didn't say what the Torah says she says. She didn't, they say kara, she didn't say these words. So what happens? So the Mishnah says, it's kosher. Okay, she didn't do it all, but she did removing of the shoe and the spitting. Fine. What about if she said everything and she spit, but she didn't take off his shoe? Then the Mishnah says, pesula. then the chalitza is not kosher. That doesn't work. You need chalitza. What about the other case? Chaltza vikara avolo rachika. What, she took the shoe off and she said all the right words, but she didn't spit. So here there's a dispute. Rabbi Eliezer omer chalitzata pesula. Rabbi Eliezer says the spitting, she doesn't spit in front of him, that disqualifies the chalitz. It's no good. Rabbi Akiva omer chalitzata kashera. Rabbi Akiva, who's his pupil, by the way. Rabbi Akiva is the pupil of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva has two great teachers. One is Rabbi Eliezer and one is Rabbi Yoshua. So he disagrees with his teachers. He becomes like a colleague. He's great Rabbi Akiva. These are three of the greats of the Talmud. So they disagree. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer quotes the verse in Devarim chapter 25, verse 9. Kacha ye'aseh, this must you do. And the word kacha is often, as the Gemara understands it, you must do this. And failure to do so renders the ritual invalid. Says Rabbi Eliezer, kacha ye'aseh, right? This should be done to the person who refuses to build his brother's house. Says Rabbi Eliezer, says kacha, you got to do this. You didn't do it. Kol davar shu ma'aseh ma'akev, kacha ye'aseh. So he agrees that the reading of the words doesn't invalidate. But kocho yeyaseh, such shall be done. Everything that's a deed, that's an action, is ma'akev. Ma'akev means it holds you back. It invalidates it. That's a very important word, ma'akev. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Bisham Raya, says Rabbi Akiva, you think that's a good proof? Kocho yeyaseh la'ish, kol davar shu ma'aseh ba'ish. Says Rabbi Akiva, no, from the very verse that you cite to support you, I can support myself. Thus shall be done to the man. The stuff that is done to the man himself, like taking off his shoe, that's done to the person. But spitting in front of him, that's nothing done to the man. It's in front of him. So that would not invalidate this. So in other words, there's a disagreement in the Mishnah. You have a description in the Torah of this process. What they disagree about is from a sort of, let's say, legal standpoint, which of these elements would invalidate, what is central or not central. So Rabbi Akiva thinks that the only central one is the untying of the shoe. That's what's central. The other two are required, but they're not invalidating if you fail to do it. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer disagreed about the spitting part. Okay. Let's see, because we're very limited with time over here, let's take a look at Mishnah number 6, because that describes the whole process. Mishnah number 6 of chapter 12. Mitzvah and chalitza. Let me stop. Are there any questions about this to this point? No questions.
It's been quiet in chat, but please do speak. Feel welcome to speak.
I'm sorry. I had a question in Perek Yud Aleph.
We'll have to wait with that. I'm just in the middle of your days now.
Okay.
Back to Yud Aleph. All right. About what topic?
The 5 who are married, and then they have to do 4 chalitzas and 1 yibum.
That's complicated. Yeah, right. I won't deal with that now. Maybe next week. There's one additional class, which is next week. Next week we'll do a summary of the basic principles of Masechet Yevamot. I also want to do a little more with Aguna, so that will be next week. So maybe you can bring it up next week. Some of the mishnayos are complex. That's one of them. That's a crazy case, right? He married 4 or 5 times, right? Okay, let's just take a look at this Mishnah here, the last Mishnah of chapter 12. Mitzvah chalitza, says the Mishnah. This is the way it's supposed to work. This is the whole procedure. Bahu v'yavimto lebeitin. Vein masien lo esa hahugenet lo. Shenemar. The Korolo Zignei Iro Vidibru Elav. Okay, so what's the case? The Torah says, this is what the Torah says. Torah says in chapter 25 that a man dies without children and the brother is supposed to marry her, right? Fine. For the purpose of that the dead brother's name should be continued. However, it says in the Torah in chapter 25 in verse number 7, The man, the man refuses to marry the Yevama. Then the woman should go up to the gate to the elders. And she says, my Yavam refuses to establish the name of his brother. He refuses to marry me. So the elders call this guy and they speak to him. Sounds like he didn't go. Sounds like she went along. But they summon him to the court and they speak to him, but he refuses. He stands his ground and says, I don't want to marry her. So when you read the Chumash, it says they speak to him. What does it mean they speak to him? It's obvious when you read the Chumash, what it means is they say to this guy, Reuven, your brother Shimon died. We think it's right to marry his widow. That's what they're saying him. She complained to the court. He refuses to marry me. What? Doesn't he know about Yibum, about the brother's name being kept alive? So they summon the guy and they tell him, but he stands his ground. He says, I'm not marrying her. So in the Chumash, they're trying to convince him to marry her. But the Mishnah has a different thought. The Mishnah interprets it differently. According to the Mishnah, that's different. In other words, according to at least the Gemara's understanding of the Mishnah, they give him a piece of advice which is appropriate to him. And in the Gemara, that piece of advice sometimes means you shouldn't marry her. The Gemara has two examples of this. Say it's a very old man and a very young woman, or vice versa. There's a tremendous disparity of age. So in such a thing, that's an example of it's not such a great idea to marry her. So in that case, they say, we don't think you should marry her. In other words, according to the Mishnah, it's not that the guy's refusing. He may be actually wanting to marry her, but they would discourage it sometimes. That's Eitzah Hahugenet Lo. They tell him, this is not the right. It could be 100 reasons why it's not right. But it's interesting how the Mishnah is reinterpreting the Chumash, because when you read the Chumash, it's obvious, because it says, no, he Amad v'Amar lo lakachti l'kachta, but obviously he's saying, I don't want to marry her, and they're trying to convince him to marry her. But the Mishnah says no. They give him a piece of advice which is appropriate. Fine. The Karalo Zignei Robi Dibru Elov. They speak to him, right? The Hio merit, and now she says he refuses to marry her, whatever. For whatever reason. Hio merit, and now she says, she says these words. My Yavam refuses to establish a name for his brother, refuses to marry me. But who Omer? And he says these three words, I refuse to marry her. And they said this in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, not in translation. Fine, we'll get to that. Now I want to emphasize one point over here about what the Mishnah is saying. When you read the Chumash, okay, it sounds like guy dies, the wife assumes she's going to marry the brother. The brother, for whatever reason, doesn't want to marry. She goes to court and complains. The court summons the guy and says, you got to marry her. I'm not doing it. I'm not interested. Don't want to do it. And then we have and then, okay. And then you take off the shoe and you spit and you, etc. Now, the point is, but what the Mishnah has done in a very subtle way is transform all this into a ritual. In other words, the point is when the Torah, she says he doesn't want to marry. And he says, I don't want to marry her. She says he doesn't want to establish a name. I don't want to marry her. In the Chumash, that's just an expression of what each side is claiming. It's two claims. But in the Mishnah, it's not an expression of claims. The Mishnah transforms it into a ritual. And the proof is obvious. It's got to be in Hebrew. There's a whole chapter in the Mishnah in Masechet Sota, Elul Ne'emarim. It's a 6 or 7 chapter. I think it's 6 or 7 of Sota. These are the things you got to say only in Hebrew, and these are the things you can say in any language. And for the most part, If it's just a matter of understanding, it can be in any language. When it's a ritual, for example, the priestly blessing. The priestly blessing, says the Mishnah, has to be with these 15 words. That's the ritual of the priestly blessing. It's like a relic of the temple. When it comes to service in the temple, it's very precise. You throw the blood a certain way, sprinkle it this way, etc. So Birkat Kohanim is like a temple ritual, and this is the way you do it. Over here, we would never have thought such a thing. We would have said, it's not a ritual. She says he doesn't want to marry me, and she really should marry me. He says, I don't want to do it. Okay, they try to convince him, and he stands by what he says. He sticks to it. You sure you don't want to marry her? I don't want to marry her. You shouldn't marry me. I don't want to. Okay, then they do chalitza. But the Mishnah has transformed chalitza into a ritual. That's what's interesting over here, among other things. So it's a ritual. Becomes very different feel to it now. It's a ritual that the court is overseeing. That's just you do it in front of the court. The court plays a major role, as we'll see in a second. Now she spits in front of him. So first of all, bifanav is understood not she spits in his face. She doesn't spit on him. We saw that earlier. It's not done to him. It's done in front of him. Okay? That's what the Mishnah says. They have to see the saliva. The Dayam have to see it. You see, they play a real role over here. We would have said spitting just means it's a way of spit at somebody. It's a way of showing you that you disapprove strongly of the person or the behavior. But it becomes actually a ritual. You spit a certain way. And then she says, such shall be done to the man who refuses to build his brother's house. So obviously, in the Torah, chalitza is not a very good option. It's done to free her, but the idea is to degrade him. He's entering into a process of degradation. Ad kan hayu makrim, says the Mishnah. Up to here, the court would actually be makre. In other words, the woman and the man are repeating what the court is saying. In fact, the Gemara on the Mishnah we saw earlier about requiring three judges, even hedioto, even ignorant judges, says the Gemara, they may be ignorant, but they have to know Hebrew. They have to be able to read. It's a minimum standard for a judge, because they're going to say these verses, and the woman repeats, and the man repeats. The man and the woman repeat what the court is saying, once again underscoring the role of the court over here. It's not like get. The court plays a major role in this chalitza ceremony. Fine. This is what they have to do. So there's three different things. The court is going to read the verses, and the man and woman repeat after them. The court is going to make sure that they see the spit. And the court is going to speak first to the man to give him a piece of advice, which in the Mishnah could be, that you shouldn't marry her. It's not for you. It's not a good idea. Or you should. The Dibru love. Fine. I mean, still they're calling the guy up. He doesn't want to marry her. They don't leave it at that. They call him up because he's supposed to marry her. But again, in the Mishnah, it's not so one-sided. Fine. The Mishnah says, and I'll stop and take some questions here. I can't hear you makrin. These are the verses that they would read to the two parties. Now the Mishnah has a story. The Gomarit kol haparsha, chuchsachu v'yod gomrim kol haparsha. But there was a case of Rabbi Hyrcanus, who was sat under some tree in Kfar Eitam. When he was one of the judges, he not only read these verses, but he read the stuff at the end of the section as well. At the end of the section, it says that so the point is, they would read all of that at the end. This is what happens to the one who doesn't want to build his brother's house, and they shall call this person Beit Chalut Hanal. So that also, when Rabbi Hyrcanus, in the story the Mishnah tells, Rabbi Hyrcanus read the entire parsha, the whole parsha in Sefer Devarim, chapter 25. And when that happened, the other judges, from that point on, the other courts took this on as a message to them, and then it became a common practice that the court would read the entire parsha. And a person shall be called Beit Chalutz Hanal, the house of the one whose shoe was taken off. Mitzvah b'dayanim v'lo mitzvah b'talmidim. Says the Mishnah, the court, the judges will say this. Not the talmidim. In the court, typically, the typical court, so is true of the higher courts in Israel, there were judges, but in the court itself, there were pupils who would actually witness what the court is doing. And those pupils have their two functions for the talmidim in the court. One is just to learn to see how the court functions. But the other one is that sometimes if a judge became disqualified or had to leave or whatever, then the people standing in front, the talmidim, would then take the place of the judge. So there's sort of kind of a alternate jurors we have today. You choose a jury, then people are chosen as alternates just in case one of the jurors gets sick or whatever happens, disqualified. So the court had that also. They're the talmidim. So the Mishnah says this Beit Chalutz Hanal was ordered by the judges and not by those sitting in the court. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mitzvah kol ha'omdim sham lomar Chalutz Hanal, Chalutz Hanal, Chalutz Hanal. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Everyone in the court is supposed to say, all of them, who's ever there, 3 times, Chalutz Hanal. In other words, again, the idea, and I mentioned this earlier, that the idea of publicizing. And when it comes to chalitza, it's not just rendering a decision, it's also publicizing. If this particular fellow refused to do chalitza. It's also a way of publicizing that this woman is now free to marry anybody else. This is the last Mishnah in chapter 12 that deals with the ceremony of chalitza. Why Rabbi, who set up the Mishnah, waited till 12 chapters to tell us this, I don't have a good answer for, but this is where the Mishnah was. So this is chalitza. This is where you have chalitza in chapter 12. And again, interesting, among other things, is that the Mishnah seems to be deviating in actually more than one way from the plain reading of the Chumash, but apart from deviating, it transforms the chalitza into a kind of ceremony in which the court becomes a central player. Okay, let me just stop. Yes.
Since you're stopping for questions, can I highlight one? This is from Ellen Vasquez.
Yes.
Ellen, let me know if I'm misquoting you. Nowadays, when Yibum isn't really done and both parties want to do chalitza, does it matter that the set text doesn't represent what's actually happening?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. Yeah, my answer would be not really. I mean, the truth is, look, I'll make 2 points about chalitza. First of all, even in the Gemara, chalitza poses several problems, actually. I mean, apart from the fact that people don't particularly care to go through this ceremony, because even though it's presented as a degrading ceremony for the man, but I've spoken to several women who said they're not particularly crazy about the ceremony for the women either. So it's not a ceremony that. Number two, the question is an excellent question, because in the Chumash, the presumption is you should do Yibum, but you don't want to do Yibum, then we have this degrading ceremony. But in point of fact, nowadays, and I mentioned this at the outset, that over time it shifted from Yibum only to Yibum, it's a choice. You could do either one. To you should only do chalitza and not do Yibum. So the question then becomes, it's an excellent question, why would you have a degrading ceremony for somebody who can't do Yibum even if he wanted to? He's not allowed to do Yibum. In the state of Israel, Yibum is actually forbidden. No one is really doing Yibum. It was being done in certain Sephardic communities, but even they, for the most part, have completely stopped it. So the answer, I have no good answer except to say that these things sort of live on, even when the reason for it is not totally, meaningful anymore. But chalitza is seen as necessary for the woman to remarry, just like the get is necessary. Now, what is true is 2 things. First of all, there are situations where, and now this is part of the aguna issue that we'll deal with maybe the last class, which is next week. I'm doing an additional class next week. But look, part of the part of the question, how do you avoid the aguna problem? And the thinking among many people, personally, I subscribe to it 1,000%, is that you build the kedushin in such a way that if things aren't working out, the marriage is null and void automatically without even needing again. It's like a conditional marriage. And part of the reason people want to do that is not, or they want to include in that, not just that because you don't want a situation where someone could hold up a get, but because also you want to avoid chalitza. In a situation where the couple have no children and the man dies, you don't want to get into a chalitza situation for any number of reasons. One of them is that what if the brother doesn't want to do chalitza? That's the main thing. So you don't want to be in that kind of a situation. So those who advocate for a kind of kedushin, which would eliminate ipso facto the need for a get, part of the thinking is also to eliminate the chalitza. But the function of chalitza is that without chalitza, it's like without a get, the woman is not permitted to marry anybody else if there's a brother and no children. So it's a good question, but the questioner is right about this. The logic of chalitza doesn't apply anymore. So in the way it's described, because you can't actually do yibum. So what are you degrading this guy who does chalitza? He has no choice but to do chalitza. However, there's no problem with chalitza. Now, chalitza can come up in other situations as well, which is other mishnayos, and it's another problem with chalitza, which is to do chalitza. Let's say the man has a brother. Let's say it's we have it, unfortunately, lately in Israel, a lot of these young people have been killed in war. It's a horrible thing, and they may be just newly married, and maybe there's a brother. They have no children. Maybe there's a brother, but maybe the brother is 10 years old or 8 years old. You know what I mean? Then you can't do chalitza to your bar mitzvah. That's another problem with chalitza. There are a lot of problems with chalitza, but in the chumash, the plain meaning of the chumash is the Torah assumes the guy should do chalitza. That's the assumption, and the ceremony is intended to discourage anybody from not doing it by criticizing the one who's not doing it. But already in the Mishnah, you see, Mishnah deals with other issues. Sometimes it's not a good idea to get married, etc. So that's what the Mishnah. That's a very important question. Thank you for the question. Anybody else with the question?
I think that was it for chat.
Okay, let me just say what the plan is here. So today was my last class in the Chumash. I did want to give one extra class, which is next week, the 24th of December, just because for those people that are doing the mishnayot, that's more or less when Yevamot ends. So next week, what I wanted to look at is two things. First of all, I wanted to look at just the first Mishnah in chapter 13, which deals with something called mi'un, which we haven't really dealt with, and that's an important topic in the tractate. I did want to say a few more words about aguna, which is the subject of the last two chapters, and I did want to just overall just review what are the core principles of Tractate Yevamot: yibum, chalitza, mamar, mi'un, all kinds of other things that we haven't really Sarah. There are about 10 or so principles that run through the tractate, and which just to give some kind of sense, some kind of review, which gives a bigger picture about what Masechet Yevamot is about. Obviously, there's much more here, but I try to focus on the stuff that's relevant mostly to the core issues in the tractate, and of course, the core issue is Yibum and of course the Chalitza as well. So that we'll take care of next week. That'll be the last class next week. Looking forward. You can always, if you have any questions, you can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org.
Thank you so much.
And just to highlight, if you are continuing learning Mishnah Yomit through Ketubot, I want to highlight our continuation of this class on Ketubot. Ketubot, next week, we will meet, as Rabbi Silber said, at our usual time, 1 p.m. on Sunday. But after that, this class will continue on Tuesday nights with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. I am going to post in chat the link. And you can keep on learning. That way you can sign up at the link 5784.drisha.org/winter. It will also take you to the signups for our Wintersman on organ donation, where you can learn either in the late mornings with Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner and people from Renewal about the more practical aspects of organ donation, and in the afternoons with Rabbi Reifman on the more on the halacha side and the theory side. This will take place through December 25th through 27th. So if you are lucky enough to have time off then, please consider getting some learning in. And with that, everyone should have a good afternoon, good evening, a good day, wherever you are.
Thank you.